This is Kai Hostetter-Habib, and I am interviewing Mark Hostetter on the topic of HIV/AIDS as part of my Riverdale Senior Project. The interview took place on May 11th, 2022 at my house located in Manhattan. This interview was recorded using an iPhone. So just as an opening question, tell me about yourself, who you are, your job, things you like to do for fun, and any social identifiers you would like to share.
Okay, I'm Mark Hostetter. I am 63 years old. I'm beginning to develop Alzheimer's, so I don't remember all the questions, but tell you anything about myself. I identify as gay. I've been married 30 years. I came out probably publicly to everybody at about 25 years old, which was about 1985, but knew I was gay since the mid-70s and actually had relationships since then.
Great. So what was your childhood like before 1981?
So in 1981, I was 22 years old. So before that, obviously I went to high school. Nobody was out in my high school at all, at Riverdale Country School. So that was really not an option for anybody at the time. It was just not something anybody did. There were no TV shows with gay characters. There were no movies with gay characters, really, very few. So it was mostly people discovering about themselves by themselves, kind of thing. It was a very loving childhood. My parents were always very supportive. I didn't come out to them until I was 25 years old, but I don't think I ever really feared that that would be a problem when I did come out. So it was a happy childhood, basically, and a happy college experience as well.
Great. So then what were you doing between the years of 1981 and 1995?
So 1981, I had graduated from college and was at law school. And so I was at law school. I graduated law school in 1984. So during those years, basically, I was a student, a graduate student, working towards my doctorate in law and working for a law firm in the summers, living in New York City.
Great. And then when you think about HIV and AIDS, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
To me, it's all the people that I know that have died of it. Obviously, in being 22 in 1981 up till 1995, when there was treatment for it, when I was 36 years old, for that relatively long period of time, there was constantly people dying, friends dying there. I can't even count how many people, died during that period of time. So even though AIDS is treatable now, it was something that basically meant you had a death sentence, during that period of time.
And do you remember what your first memory is of hearing about AIDS?
I don't remember exactly. It wasn't reading it in the New York Times on page A17 or whatever it was when it first came out. So it was much later than that. I wasn't really connected in with the gay press or an organized gay groups at the time. So it was probably later. But I would say certainly by 84 or so, it was out there, news was out there, you knew it was sexually transmitted. And so at that point, I think everybody who was able to and who took it seriously were using safe sex practices at that time. But not everybody was doing that, so.
Great. So then I know you went to law school in New York, and this was obviously between 1981 and 1984. Mm-hmm. So what was New York like during those early years of the epidemic?
It was coming out of the 70s, which was party, right? So there were Studio 54, and there was clubs and things like that. So there was definitely a atmosphere of fun. Stonewall was 15 years before that. So New York City, I think there was definitely a gay culture, a club culture kind of thing, as well as people who would want to have more intimate experiences with people. I was a law student, and so I studied all the time, so that wasn't really part of my experience of it, but it was clearly a time when people were very free to enjoy life in a way that involved things that today you would never do, including sex with multiple partners, including drug use. Coming out of the late 70s, marijuana was used by everybody, and so it was very much of a atmosphere like that, which then shifted once AIDS came around, because everybody sort of turned inward a bit.
And what was it like coming to terms with your sexuality during these early 80s?
I think it was definitely something that sort of preoccupied you in terms of who you'd meet, who you talk to, who you would date. I was fortunate in that I had one person that I was involved with during that period of time, and so I wasn't really looking around for people. However, I think it definitely would affect, how willing you were to enter into a relationship with somebody who didn't know a whole lot about. They didn't have HIV tests at that point either, so there was no way of confirming, that somebody was negative or positive. Plus, there was a delay. If you got infected today, it could be months until you would develop antibodies, even though you were still able to transmit it. So there was no way of knowing, who was HIV positive or not.
So would you say there was fear surrounding this, either within you or the community around you?
Yeah, I think there was very much fear. I mean, especially when the death rate increased, which it did as you got into the later part of the 80s. So at the beginning, it was few and far between people who were dying, but you heard about it. Once you got into the late 80s and early 90s, everybody knew somebody, and many people who died. So yes, it was everywhere, and it was not treatable. So you definitely were afraid, in some ways, afraid. You didn't want that death sentence, but also you didn't want to transmit it if you did have it, kind of thing. So it just sort of put an inhibitory fear on everybody. Yeah.
And I know, especially from 1983 to 1986 and before that, there was a lot of confusion around the ways that HIV and AIDS could be transmitted. So really, how do you see that manifest itself in your life and the feelings you had at this time?
Well, I think until it became clear that it was sexually transmitted, I think nobody really knew. Could you get it from kissing? Could you get it from touching somebody? That kind of thing. And so there was a period of time, and once you got to, like you said, 85 or 86, I think people understood what transmitted it. But before that, people didn't really know. I think people in the gay community were not going to say that they weren't part of the gay community, or that they were going to abandon their friends or things like that. And I think people had compassion for each other, and so I think people were not just isolating themselves the way people are doing during COVID. So there wasn't that kind of a sense of how people moderated their behavior. But once it became known how it was transmitted, then I think people did modify their behavior.
Great. So how did you feel about the Reagan administration during these early years? In particular, its response to AIDS, and you can be as blunt or explicit as you want.
Well, I'm sure you're getting a universal response. Ronald Reagan never even said the word AIDS, never did anything, and so money was not transmitted to it. It was seen as a gay disease. Gays were on the out of society, and so it just wasn't a high priority. Straight people didn't think it affected them. Reagan sort of reflected the worst of that, and so the criticism of him, the anger of him at not directing the government to take this seriously when tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands, were dying of this, was something that everybody felt extremely badly about. There were groups that about, ACT UP and other ones, that GMHC, that really were focused on caring for people, but also for trying to mobilize the public, to realize that this was an issue. As you got into the later 80s, there were some TV shows and movies that began to deal with this issue and identify the problems with not recognizing it as a pandemic, that could affect a lot more people than just an isolated group who people didn't think they know. Everybody knows somebody who's gay now because everyone comes out, National Coming Out Day and all that kind of thing, and it's much more open. Back then, people who were straight didn't think they knew anybody who was gay, even though they did, just because nobody was out.
Great. So during the 80s, were you involved with the gay community in New York City, whether that be through socializing or through activism or whatnot?
For me, I was very marginally involved in it. I was involved with a Presbyterian group for gay Presbyterians, and that was more like we came together and we talked and we went on retreats and we went out to dinner and things like that. But other than that, I wasn't really a part of sort of the quote gay community in New York City. But I think people found their families, their chosen families. My family was not a problem, and so I wasn't rejected by my family. But you did find people who you shared a commonality with. For me, it was a group of Presbyterians, so I was involved with them, but not really involved in a lot of the other organizations.
So could you describe perhaps differing or similar attitudes of yourself as a gay person compared with those of your straight friends and family?
I think for me it was more real because they were my friends who were dying. I think my family was very empathetic and very supportive of the gay community. My mother was sort of the adoptive mother of any gay person whose family had rejected them, and so it was never really the circles of straight friends that I was in. I don't think really had much of a different attitude than mine. They were aghast at what was happening, and they were trying to do whatever they could to support people who were in it. But I think there is a fundamental difference when it's certainly during that period of time when it seemed like it was caused by being gay and engaging in practices that were almost exclusive to being gay. It certainly would affect you more than straight people. There's a lot of data, false or real, back then that was sort of downplaying the risk of heterosexual sex versus gay sex, and so the media and science in some way was sort of complicating the belief that it was really just a gay person's disease. So in the end, yes, I think if you were gay, it affected you in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Great. So then, do you know about what time the attitudes of the so-called straight world started to shift?
So I think once you got to the later 80s, everybody knew somebody who died, whether you were straight or gay. You realized that this was a huge thing and it was not going away. It was not going to be isolated to a community that didn't relate to you. So I think by the time you got to the late 80s, there was still no treatment that was effective that would prevent death. It might postpone it a bit, but I think everybody began, at least in sort of areas like New York and places like that, I think people were realizing that it was an issue. Organizations like Broadway Cares, which was Stamp Out AIDS before it started, some of the AIDS houses, Bailey House, the supportive place for patients, people who had AIDS, started growing up. And so there was much more support for people who had AIDS, and churches would support it. First Presbyterian Church had a ministry to support the AIDS, people who had AIDS, but there still was no cure until you got, or there still was no cure, but there was no treatment until you got to the mid-90s.
Great. Now I just want to take a moment for you to tell me really your story about AIDS and how it impacted you.
So my story impacted me, as I said, with a lot of people who I knew who died, starting in the mid-'80s all the way to the mid-'90s. And even after that, as recently as several years ago, there's still people who die from AIDS-related complications, even though their lives have been extended, for a long time. For me personally, my partner, my first love, whatever you want to call it, passed away in '94 of AIDS, and it was only less than a year later when they had the treatment for it, which would have put it into remission, and he would have survived. So that was something that obviously affected me personally. I knew lots of friends who died, but that was the most intimate one. He actually died in my apartment at night, when he was getting sicker and sicker. He didn't want to go to the hospital because he knew he would wind up just dying in the hospital, which wouldn't have been very comforting, or supportive or whatever. And, he just got sicker and sicker. You develop neuropathy where your feet, your nerves hurt. He developed a MAC, which was a respiratory infection. You develop the lesions, that were on your skin. Your tongue, becomes coated with this, it's had some weird name, hairy leukopenia or something or other, but you got sick and you treated the symptoms. You had diarrhea all the time, kind of thing, and you just did what you could to make that person feel as comfortable as possible. So for me, that was the most intense part of it. Once you got to 1995 and there was this cocktail of 3 antiretroviral drugs, pretty much immediately it stopped people from dying, certainly in the kinds of multiples that were happening before, and even people who were fairly advanced and had been living with no T cells for years with huge viral loads, wound up living for a long time after that. So it was like a sea change in the way people were surviving. It made you feel like if they had invested money in this 10 years before, they would have come up with a solution and saved lots more lives.
Thank you. So if you're comfortable sharing, what was it like to care for people with AIDS, whether that be your partner or your friends?
So I think once people realized that it was transmitted by bodily fluids and unprotected sexual activity, I think you could care for them in a way that you didn't fear for yourself, at all those times. And so just like you would care for anybody who was dying of some untreatable disease or in late stage disease that's leading towards death, you just provided the comfort and care that you could provide. You could get caught up in the anger of there not being something that was being done about it, but your day-to-day life was of caring for somebody who was having a harder time caring for themselves, and you both knew that they were going to die soon. So there was the physical caring for them, but there was also the emotional caring for them, and the emotional caring for yourself, because you had to talk to friends and people who could support you as you were being a caregiver to somebody else at the same time.
So what did that support system for yourself as you were caring for other people look like?
For me, it was friends mostly, who how you could talk to, because AIDS was not treatable and was sort of a death sentence. It was not something that a lot of people disclosed. And so for Rick's example, my partner Rick, he was not really public about him. He just would stay out of the public eye, not do stuff with people. And so you couldn't really share that with people unless you got their permission, to talk to it. And Rick knew of common friends that we had that he said it was fine to disclose that to. And so those were the people who you could be unfettered, transparent, with, so that they could understand what you were going through. But you had to honor the person's wishes about whether or not they wanted to disclose that they were HIV positive or not, because it was more than a stigma. And then it would impact everybody else. Everybody would assume you're HIV positive and that you were going to die, and it would just change the dynamic of the way people interacted with you. And so it was more common than not, I think, for people not to disclose that they were HIV positive or had AIDS or even were at advanced stages of AIDS. And so you just had a very small group of people who would support you in that kind of a way.
So how did some people change their behaviors once someone disclosed that they were HIV positive?
So I think most people in my circle of friends, I don't think would have ostracized me or anybody, for it. But I think they would perhaps change the way they think about you, in that there was a sense that you would die more imminently than you would otherwise die. And so the way you relate to somebody when you know they're going to die is different in some ways. And so I think people throughout their lives want people to continue to treat them the way they always have treated you. And so I think that's the biggest thing. So I'm not sure here in New York, where people understood how it was transmitted, people would say, I'm not going to be your friend, or I'm not going to get together with you, or they would fear for themselves. I don't think that was so much of it. But I think the idea that people would treat you differently, not as an outcast, but as a person who is going to die, would affect your relationships, that kind of thing.
And I know previously you mentioned feeling anger and obviously sadness, and I was just wondering if you could speak more on these emotions that arose.
Right. So, the anger at first is that, why is this happening at all, right? It just seems unfair. The second degree of anger is, why isn't more being done about it, when there's so much more money thrown at so many other things. So that was the sense of anger. I think the question is what you do with that anger. You can just internalize it and be mad and chant and march and do all those things, all of which are important. You can, the way I did it was supported organizations that were sprouting up, for research, but also for care, and making sure that there's money available to come up with solutions, as well as provide for the people who have it, who have HIV and have AIDS. So the anger for me didn't result so much in protesting. This is for me. It resulted more in devoting my time and energy to organizations that, at least I thought, would help, move the whole thing forward.
Great. And then, looking back on the AIDS epidemic 30 to 40 years later, is there anything you would tell your past self?
Life continues on, and the life I have now and the family I have now is not because of the changes that came up of it, but in some ways were related to that. And you can make the best out of life, and in fact your life can be amazing, even though it's not the way you had originally expected it to be. So as we come through trauma, as we come through crises, as we come through things that seem like they're darkest of times, there is light ahead and there's joy ahead, even beyond what you could ever imagine. So, so I guess I would tell myself then, keep fighting, keep doing everything you could do to do it. But when you're confronted with such depths of sadness and loss, know that there's a future, ahead that can be bright and amazing.
Okay, so before we wrap up this interview, is there any story in particular, or instance, or anything else that you would like to say?
I think, the idea that the story isn't forgotten, as to what happened then. I mean, it obviously affected a particular generation, the ones that you're interviewing now, and it doesn't really affect in ways that impact lives the same way, generations that came afterwards. But that doesn't mean there won't be something else that does. And so the lessons that can be learned from looking at a crisis like this, for populations that don't necessarily seem like they would affect the majority or seem like they would affect you, it's sort of it's a good thing to understand, whether it's through movies or interviews or research projects or whatever, because it makes you understand how people deal with issues, that come up. And hopefully when there's another crisis like COVID or something else like that, that doesn't affect the broad population, there'll still be the sympathy and the empathy and the care for those populations, even though the vast majority of the world isn't affected by them.
Great. So is there anything else you would like to add that you didn't have time to say or that I didn't ask about?
No, I think that this is great. I mean, these stories, people could tell you hours and hours of every person that they know, right, who have died, that make these stories real. And in some ways that makes it more human and makes it more relatable. But I think your project is really hitting on what we as a society can learn, whether it has to do with politics or media or the healthcare system, that could be lessons that we learn going forward. So I think there's a lot of drama in all of this, but there's also the lessons to be learned. And I think this kind of research really helps focus on those lessons, as opposed to just focusing on the stories that are there as well too. So it's good.
Well, thank you so much for taking this time to be.
You are welcome.